Hey everybody, welcome back to Buy the Book. Today we're going to be doing the fourth review of the Adventures of Tintin series, Cigars of the Pharaoh, what I consider to be the first great Tintin adventure. So Cigars of the Pharaoh was serialised in Le Petit Vingtième between the 8th of December 1932 and the 8th of February 1934, and for the fourth adventure, Hergé was eager to write a mystery story as this genre was becoming increasingly popular across Western Europe in the 1930s, thanks in no part to people like Agatha Christie. And the inspiration behind the story came from Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, and a lot of the kind of media tabloid claims of a curse of the pharaohs that was very popular and very prominent around that time, considering the ill-fated expedition after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. There were different versions of the book that were released, and updates made in the 1955 edition include various scenes which effectively did nothing to further the plot, or Hergé felt they were irrelevant to the overall story, such as, for example, Tintin confronting a crocodile, a bat and some snakes. In addition to this, the Arabian city that Tintin's snowy search for in the story is no longer named as Mecca. I guess in a way this was done to avoid controversy, perhaps something like that. And also the character of Alan was also added into the story in a later reprint, having originally been introduced in Crab with the Golden Claws, and Alan eventually became quite I'm not going to say an important character, but he was a reoccurring villain that appeared throughout the story. He was in Crab with the Golden Claws. I believe, if I remember correctly, he appeared in the Red Sea Sharks as well, in Flight 714. And yeah, he became a very important reoccurring character in that story. So that being said, some of the background notes out of the way, let's get on to the review. So, Cigars of the Pharaoh, guys, is, like I said in the introduction, kind of the first great adventure. It's the first Adventures of Tintin story where I look at it and I think, this story really was a great adventure. It's also, as well, the first story which does not include Tintin in the title. It's just simply called Cigars of the Pharaoh. And in addition to this, it's also the first story which introduces quite a lot of characters. I did just previously mention Alan, but you could perhaps argue whether this in reality was his true first appearance, because ultimately he wasn't actually included in the original 1932-1934 editions. He was only added later in the 1955 editions. But there are two characters, two major characters anyway, and then two other smaller reoccurring characters that are first introduced properly in this story. The first one I want to mention is Thompson and Thompson. Now, I don't know why I didn't mention this in Tintin the Congo, but in a later edition of Tintin the Congo, Thompson are actually added into the very first panel of the story, where Tintin is saying goodbye to Belgium and he's talking about that he's going on his trip to the Congo, and you can see Thompson in the very first panel of the story. However, this was added in later on, so this was not kind of part of the original 1930-1931 story. So in a way, and because it was a cameo as well, not really a true indication of their first appearance. So their first proper appearance chronologically in the series is Cigars of the Pharaoh. In addition to that as well, Rastapopoulos. I know I mentioned in Tintin America that there is a character who looks very much like Rastapopoulos in the very last scene. Again, though, we don't know for sure. It's a very small cameo. This is his first proper appearance. So basically, in terms of the chronology of the series, going by the original editions, Thompson have their first appearances here, and also Rastapopoulos. In addition to that as well, you've also got the first appearances of two. They are technically recurring characters, but I believe that they're only featured in one other album aside from this, and that is the travelling salesman Oliveira de Figueira, who Tintin meets when he's on the boat at the start of the story, and also the Sheikh Babaler, I think that's how you say it, who again Tintin meets in the Arabian part of the story. In addition to that as well, it is also the first two-part adventure, being the first of two parts, the second part being the Blue Lotus. And in addition to that as well, it's also what I kind of consider to be the first like multi-country, first global adventure in a way. I know you could argue that Tintin the Land of the Soviets, it had some stuff at the very beginning of the story that was set in Germany and then at the very end as well. But in terms of like the majority of the adventure taking place across multiple countries, I think Cigars of the Pharaoh is the one that does it the best, and it's the one that did it first as well. So yeah, let's kind of get on to the actual story itself. So at the start of the story, Tintin is taking a cruise. He's travelling around the Mediterranean when he bumps into a man called Dr. Sarcophagus, who basically informs him that he's trying to discover the whereabouts of a certain hidden tomb. He's an Egyptologist and he wants to find out where this tomb is. Tintin decides to assist him on this journey, and this then kind of leads into this much more, in a way, darker but much more interesting adventure that comes out of it. On the boat, Tintin has his first run-in with Rastapopoulos, and it's quite a nasty run-in, but the two later make up in later exchanges, and then they seem like they're on good terms and they become good friends. Or certainly Rastapopoulos helps Tintin out in this story. That is something that does not last throughout the series. And Tintin discovers that as the story starts to progress, there's this mysterious symbol that's being used, or it seems to keep appearing across the world wherever he travels to. So he first notices it in the Egyptian desert when they're trying to uncover the tomb. He later notices it in the same tomb on some boxes of cigars. And it's later revealed that this symbol is in fact a symbol of an international drug organisation who are using the cigars that are hidden in tombs and are hidden, in various places, to transport their product and hide the opium inside the cigars to then transport it around the world. And we find out throughout this story, as I said, that there's a lot of people who are all interconnected with this organisation. We get a glimpse at our first secret society later on in the story. And I felt, guys, in terms of the story, this was really, really well done. I really felt really engaged in this story. I felt it was a great mystery story. It took us from basically from the cruise where Tintin starts off into the deserts of Egypt, then across to the Arabian Peninsula, and then across to India later on. So it takes place across a wide geographical area. The drawings are absolutely fantastic. I think it really does capture very well the essence of each place where it's set. And the humour is absolutely great. As I said about the drawings, there's a lot of supernatural imagery being used for the first time as well. There's an interesting dream sequence where Tintin goes into the tomb at the start, and he kind of falls under a sort of, it's like a type of poison gas that's being used, but it sends him into like a hallucinogenic state. And I felt that all these things combined together really, really made the story worthwhile. We get it again a bit later on where Tintin comes across the fakir in the Indian part of the story, and we kind of have more of this supernatural, this almost paranormal kind of activity going on. There's mentions of spirits and things like that. There's secret societies. So yeah, this adventure has a lot of stuff going for it. It has a lot of adventure. It has a lot of stuff going on. Very, very action-packed. Quite fast-paced. I don't always feel as though the pacing is quite on point because it feels like you're rushing from one scene to the next. But generally speaking, I feel that it does a pretty good job considering how much is actually packed into the story. The humour, I think, is much more on point in this story as well. I feel that Hergé really nailed it with a lot of the characters' dialogues and the interactions. Dr. Sarcophagus, who Tintin meets on the boat at the start, is quite witty and quite funny, and then obviously he becomes even more so, but largely because he falls under the madness spell. Apart from these things, guys, apart from, like I said, the pacing, there's not a whole lot I dislike about this story. I think, generally speaking, it does a really, really good job. There are some scenes which I would say rely quite heavily on exposition, and I think, again, this is kind of a symptom of Hergé's kind of 2-page at a time format that he was going with, that he did for Le Petit Vingtième when it was being serialised. And yeah, it's kind of an issue that does kind of play the stories throughout the earlier stuff, throughout his earlier work. Again, just to kind of highlight it, that Tintin will get himself into situations which are very quickly resolved, or they're not always resolved in the most, should we say, satisfying way. I also did notice this story does seem to suffer a bit from exposition. There's a few scenes where Tintin will get out of a situation and then it's revealed later on he just kind of says to the reader, oh, this is what happened in the blank sort of space that we didn't see. So yeah, there is a bit of exposition. The pacing isn't always so great. Some people have also complained about the story taking place in India towards the end. I actually like the India part of the story. I think it's not necessarily better than the Arabian part or the Egyptian part of the story, but I think it really shows the reach that this drug organisation have, and it shows just how embedded they are in pretty much everybody who Tintin encounters in this story. I mean, pretty much near enough most of the people that Tintin encounters is in some way involved with this drug organisation, and yeah, it's just kind of like a slow build up of unravelling the clues and coming across all these new people, how they're all interconnected and things like that. Another quick thing I do want to say, which is certainly a highlight about Thompson and Thompson, I actually find in this story they are a lot more competent than they were in later stories. And whether this was done deliberately, I'm guessing it probably was, but it just seems like Thompson actually seems to be pretty good detectives, like in this story, whereas in later stories, as we know, they're kind of bumbling, they're pretty stupid and things like that. But yeah, after time there's a bit of a cat and mouse chase going on between Thompson, Tintin. They initially tried to arrest him because of charges of drug smuggling and gun running, even though it was falsely planted on Tintin, all of these things, and he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when they discovered the guns, and Tintin was in the same location. But yeah, aside from these things, I feel that Thompson generally are pretty competent about the story. There is what I would say in this story as well, guys, perhaps the very last instance of what I might call racial prejudice in a way, in which I noticed that there was a part of the story where Snowy comes across a cow, and because he bites the cow, they get into an argument, and it's quite a funny little scene, but Snowy and the cow get into an argument, which is in the India part of the story. Some local Indians see this, and they basically capture Snowy and are prepared to sacrifice him because of course, in India, cows are sacred. And basically the sacrifice is interrupted by a voice coming from the altar, which is where they're about to sacrifice, and they instantly believe it's the gods. They run away, they get scared and freaked out, and it's revealed to be Thompson, who, because of their commitment to the case, they wanted to kind of see Snowy arrested themselves, and they do this in another part of the story as well with Tintin, where they effectively save his life just because they want to be the ones who arrest Tintin and put him away. But I did just feel in that small moment that they kind of portrayed the Indians as a bit kind of almost childlike in a way, believing too much about the supernatural, being duped quite easily. And it was something that I mentioned about the Native Americans in Tintin America as well. But I felt, yeah, once again, it was sort of shown here. So it's perhaps the very last sort of bit of racial prejudice that I can certainly remember in the Adventures of Tintin series. But yeah, I think with that all being said, guys, overall, I really, really like Cigars of the Pharaoh. I think the final chase scene as well, just to kind of wrap up the review, the final chase scene in which Tintin chases the fakir because he's stolen the Maharaja's son, who's a character who we come across later on, is a really, really great finale. It's a great third act. It does show the stakes as well, because the fakir does seem to be quite a dangerous enemy that Tintin comes across. And yeah, I think right from start to finish, it's very action-packed, pacing a little off, like I mentioned, but there's a lot going for it. There's a lot of mystery to unravel. It's really, really interesting. It's very in-depth with just how far the International Drug Organisation have gone with their criminal operation. Of course, we get a lot of firsts in this story. The first appearances of many iconic characters. The first kind of multi-country adventure, the first real global adventure. And yeah, overall, I really like Cigars of the Pharaoh. I think it's a great story. There's a lot going for it. The only things, like I said, that I can mention that I'm not such a fan of is that perhaps just one scene or so where Tintin, it kind of shows there's a little bit of racial prejudice towards the Indians in their kind of childlike behaviour. The pacing can be a little bit quick at times. Some of the exposition that's used to kind of resolve some of the situations. And apart from this, I would say the rest of the story is really good. So, with that being said, guys, let's go on to the final score. So, taking everything into consideration, I've decided to give Cigars of the Pharaoh an 8 out of 10. I think by far and away this is easily the best story of the adventures so far. While I felt that Tintin America was certainly a step up from Tintin the Congo and Land of the Soviets, it was a decent story, but it wasn't like a real great story, whereas I feel Cigars of the Pharaoh was certainly the first real great story. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this one. I think it certainly shows for the first time that Hergé is a master of his work. And yeah, it's like I said, it's the first story that introduces some of the major iconic characters. It's the first story with a lot of firsts in itself. First, multi-country adventure. First one to drop the Tintin in title. Yeah, it's a really good book, and I highly recommend, if you haven't read this one, you should definitely pick this one up, because I think, certainly comparing it to the previous three stories, Cigars of the Pharaoh absolutely knocks it out of the park. So yeah, easily, without a doubt, the best story, an 8 out of 10, can 100% recommend this one. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be back next week for the second part of this two-part adventure story, The Blue Lotus. So yeah, I'll see you next time and we'll talk about that one.